At 58, her children took everything she had. They left her with a house full of ghosts and a flooded cellar no one wanted. But what she found in the dark, cold water would not just change her future, but rewrite the entire story of her past. If you've ever felt like your own story was taken from you, hit that subscribe button, because this is a place for people who know what it means to start over. The lawyer's pen made a dry, scratching sound, like a leaf skittering across pavement. It was the only sound in the sterile, beige room. My son Mark sat across the table, his face a mask of impatient duty. My daughter Jessica sat beside him, refusing to meet my eyes, her fingers twisting the strap of a handbag that cost more than my monthly grocery bill. They were strangers wearing the faces of my children. Mr. Henderson, a man whose kindness was perpetually at war with the legal documents he drafted, slid the final page toward me. His expression was one of professional pity. "Eleanor," he said, his voice soft, "this just confirms the division of assets as agreed. Once you sign, the house funds will be transferred to Mark and Jessica's accounts, and you'll have 60 days to vacate the premises." Agreed. That was a funny word for it. It had not been an agreement. It had been an ultimatum, delivered over lukewarm coffee in a diner that smelled of stale grease. "It's what Dad would have wanted," Jessica had said, her voice wavering with a practiced, false sympathy. "To see us financially secure." Mark, ever the pragmatist, had just nodded. "The market is high, Mom. It's the smart move. It's too much house for you anyway." Too much house. 35 years of my life, the place where I had raised them, nursed their fevers, celebrated their birthdays, mourned their father, reduced to square footage and market value. Richard had been gone for 2 years, and in that time, I had become an obstacle, a sentimental old woman living in their inheritance. I picked up the pen. It felt heavy, alien. My hand trembled slightly. I looked from Mark's tight jaw to Jessica's averted gaze. I saw no recognition there, no shared history, just a clean, sharp transaction. I thought of Richard, of his hands, calloused from the workshop, carefully planting the rose bushes by the porch. I thought of the pencil marks on the kitchen door frame, charting the growth of these two people who now wanted to erase it all. A cold fury, quiet and deep, settled in my stomach. But what could I do? They were two, I was one. They had the law, the market, the future on their side. I had only the past. I signed my name, Eleanor Vance. It looked like a stranger's signature. The scratching sound stopped. Silence flooded the room. It was done. "Good," Mark said, the single word clipped and final. He stood up, already pulling out his phone. Jessica mumbled something about having to pick up the kids. They were gone in a blur of expensive coats and hollow promises to call. I was left sitting at the polished table with Mr. Henderson. He sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to come from a place deeper than his professional obligations. "Eleanor, I'm sorry," he said. "For what it's worth, the clause about personal effects is ironclad. You have the right to take anything you want from the house. They can't touch your personal belongings." I gave a small, brittle laugh. "My personal belongings? My whole life is in that house. What am I supposed to do? Pack 35 years into a suitcase?" "The agreement also states that you are responsible for clearing the property," he added gently. "All of it, including the contents of the cellar." The cellar. A fresh wave of dread washed over me. The cellar had flooded during the big storm last spring. A foot of murky, stagnant water still sat on the concrete floor, smelling of damp earth and decay. It had been on Richard's list of things to fix. The sump pump was shot, the foundation needed sealing. But he never got to it. When the estate appraiser went down there, he took one look, held his nose, and valued the contents at 0. A total loss, he'd written in his report. Mark and Jessica had used it as a bargaining chip. "We'll let you have a bigger share of the furniture, Mom, if you just handle the mess in the basement." Another agreement I hadn't really agreed to. They were leaving me with the part of the house no one wanted. the dark, wet, forgotten part. A perfect metaphor for how I felt. Driving home, it was still home, for 59 more days. The world felt blurry, unreal. The familiar streets of our small town looked like a movie set. The oak trees lining the road seemed to droop with a sorrow that matched my own. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always had. A simple, sturdy two-story colonial with blue shutters Richard had painted himself. But it felt different. It felt hollowed out, like a beautiful shell whose inhabitant had been forcibly evicted. I walked through the front door, and the smell of home, a mix of lemon polish, old books, and Richard's faint, lingering scent of sawdust, hit me like a physical blow. I leaned against the doorframe, and for the first time since he died, I cried without reservation. I cried for him. I cried for the children I had lost, not to death, but to something far colder. And I cried for myself, a 58-year-old woman with a broken heart and a flooded cellar. The first week was a blur of numbness. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching things, remembering. The worn spot on the arm of Richard's favorite chair. The chip in the coffee mug I'd given him for his 40th birthday. Each object was a tiny anchor to a life that was being swept away. My children called, once. Jessica's voice was bright, artificial. "Just checking in, Mom. How's the packing going? Found any old treasures?" The word treasures was laced with a casual condescension, as if my memories were just clutter to be sifted through. "It's going," I said, my voice flat. I didn't have the energy to fight, to explain. They wouldn't understand. After that, they didn't call. They texted. Brief, functional messages about logistics. "Realtor needs to take photos next Tuesday. Need you to clear the garage by the 15th. I was no longer their mother. I was the property manager for their investment. The house grew emptier with each box I packed. I sorted things into 3 piles: keep, donate, trash. The keep pile was heartbreakingly small. A few photo albums, Richard's favorite sweater, a handful of books. What good were teacups and tablecloths when you no longer had a table to put them on? I was adrift, and the only thing left to do was face the final, dreaded task. The cellar. The thought of it made my skin crawl. The dampness, the smell, the darkness. It was the repository of everything we had ever wanted to forget or put off dealing with. Broken furniture, old paint cans, boxes of things that had long lost their purpose. And now, all of it was sitting in a foot of cold, murky water. For 2 days, I just stood at the top of the cellar stairs, staring at the closed door as if it were the entrance to my own tomb. I couldn't do it. The task felt too large, too disgusting, too final. On the 3rd day, something shifted. It was a Tuesday morning, gray and drizzling. I was drinking my coffee, looking out at the wilting rose bushes, and I felt a flicker of Richard's stubbornness ignite inside me. He never backed down from a tough job. He'd just roll up his sleeves, take a deep breath, and get to it. "Well, Eleanor," I imagined him saying, a gentle smile in his voice, "that water isn't going to pump itself out." It was a small thing, a trick of the mind, but it was enough. I wasn't going to let this house, this final task, defeat me. My children saw me as weak, a relic to be managed. I would show them, or at least, I would show myself, that they were wrong. That afternoon, I drove to the hardware store. The air inside smelled of sawdust and metal, a scent that reminded me so much of Richard it made my chest ache. I found a young man in an orange apron and explained my problem. Flooded cellar, about a foot of standing water, need to pump it out and clear the junk. He was kind, his face open and sympathetic. He didn't treat me like a helpless old woman. He walked me through the options, recommending a submersible utility pump. "Easy to use," he assured me. "Just drop it in, plug it in, and run the hose out a window." He also sold me a pair of heavy-duty chest waders, a powerful headlamp, and thick rubber gloves. As I paid, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. I was buying armor. I was preparing for battle. The next morning, I stood at the top of the cellar stairs again. This time, I was dressed for war. The waiters were clumsy and smelled of rubber, but they made me feel solid, protected. I strapped the headlamp to my forehead. I took a deep breath, turned the old brass knob, and pulled the heavy door open. The smell hit me immediately, a thick, cloying odor of mildew, stagnant water, and wet earth. It was the smell of decay. I switched on the headlamp, and its bright white beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the steep wooden stairs that disappeared into the black, still water below. The light reflected off the surface, making it look like a sheet of polished obsidian. Floating on top were a few pale, ghostly things: a styrofoam cooler, a child's plastic ball, scraps of wood. My heart hammered against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to close the door and walk away. Just leave it. Let the professional cleaners my children would inevitably hire deal with this nightmare. But Richard's voice was in my head again, calm and steady. One step at a time, Elle. That's all it ever is. I took that first step. My rubber boot met the wood with a dull thud, then another and another. The air grew colder, heavier as I descended. The last step was submerged. I hesitated for a moment, then plunged my foot into the water. The cold was a shock, seeping through the thick rubber of the waders. It felt like stepping into a grave. The pump was heavy. I lowered it carefully into the water, feeling it sink to the gritty concrete floor. I ran the hose up the stairs and out the small basement window, its end resting in the overgrown grass of the side yard. I plugged it in. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a low hum, the pump vibrated to life. Water began to gush from the end of the hose outside. It was working. I stood there in the dark, in the cold water, listening to the steady thrum of the motor. It was the sound of progress, the sound of me, taking back some small piece of control. It took hours. I sat on the bottom step, just above the waterline, my headlamp beam tracing patterns on the damp stone walls. I watched as the water level slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to drop. An inch, then 2. The tops of submerged things began to emerge like ancient ruins from a receding tide. The legs of a broken card table, the rusted frame of an old bicycle, a stack of plastic storage bins, their contents a mystery. The smell intensified as the damp concrete was exposed to the air, but I didn't care. I was fixated on the process, on the slow, methodical draining of the problem. By late afternoon, the water was down to a few inches of muddy sludge. The pump sputtered as it sucked in air. I unplugged it. The sudden silence was deafening. There was only the sound of dripping water echoing in the cavernous space. I waded into the center of the room, my boots squelching in the mud. The beam of my headlamp cut across the scene. It was a mess. A lifetime of forgotten things, coated in a layer of gray, slimy silt. It looked hopeless. But as I swept the light from one corner to the other, it landed on something I didn't expect. In the far corner, partially tucked under a collapsed wooden shelf, was a large, dark green object. It was an old military-style footlocker. A trunk. Richard's trunk. I remembered it from when we first moved in. He'd brought it with him from his parents' house. I'd asked him once what was inside. Just old memories, he'd said with a shrug. Nothing important. He'd hauled it down to the cellar, and I hadn't thought about it again in 30 years. It was supposed to be empty, or at least filled with junk he couldn't bear to throw away. But this was different. It sat there, solid and implacable, while everything else around it seemed to have surrendered to the damp and decay. The wood of the shelves above it had rotted, but the metal trunk seemed untouched, save for the layer of grime. A strange curiosity, sharp and insistent, cut through my exhaustion. Why was it still here? And why did it suddenly feel so important? Wading through the muck, I reached the trunk. It was heavier than it looked. I tried to pull it out from under the shelf, but it wouldn't budge. The collapsed shelf was pinning it down. I spent the next hour wrestling with the rotten wood, pulling it apart piece by piece, my gloves covered in slime. Finally, the trunk was free. I dragged it, scraping and groaning, across the wet floor to the bottom of the stairs. It took every ounce of my strength to haul it up, step by agonizing step, out of the darkness and into the dim light of the kitchen. There it sat on my linoleum floor, a relic from another world. It was army green, with heavy-duty latches on the front, and Richard's last name, Vance, stenciled in faded white letters on the side. And it was locked. A thick, brass padlock held it shut. There was no key. For a moment, I just stared at it. This was insane. I was a 58-year-old woman, covered in mud, wrestling with a locked trunk from a flooded basement, in a house that was no longer mine. I should be packing tea towels, not playing detective. I could just leave it, let the junk haulers deal with it. But I couldn't. That feeling, that insistent pull of curiosity, was stronger now. It felt less like a choice and more like a necessity. I went to the garage and came back with a hammer and a heavy-duty screwdriver. I wedged the tip of the screwdriver into the padlock's hasp and struck it hard with the hammer. The clang echoed in the empty house. I hit it again and again, channeling all my frustration, my grief, my anger into each blow. On the fifth strike, with a sharp crack, the metal gave way. The lock sprang open. My heart was pounding. My hands, still in the damp gloves, fumbled with the cold metal latches. I lifted them, one by one. I took a deep breath, held it, and lifted the heavy lid. The inside of the trunk was dry. Completely, miraculously dry. It was lined with a thick, rubbery, waterproof material. And it wasn't empty. It was filled to the brim. But not with junk. It was packed with meticulously organized, neatly bound bundles of letters, old journals, and several large, sealed manila envelopes. On top of the pile was a single, smaller envelope with my name, Eleanor, written on it in Richard's familiar, steady handwriting. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a memory chest. This was a time capsule, a secret. I reached in with a trembling hand and picked up the envelope. The paper was thick, creamy, and felt heavy with significance. I sank into a kitchen chair, my muddy waders leaving a trail on the floor, and carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter. The date at the top was from 2 years ago, just a week before his heart attack. He must have known. He must have felt something was wrong. My eyes filled with tears before I even read the first word. "My dearest Eleanor," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I'm gone. And it means you found my box of ghosts. I am so sorry. I am sorry for the secrets I kept, but I hope, once you understand, you will see that I kept them not from you, but for you. I built our life on a foundation of love, but I realize now that it was also built on an omission, a lie of sorts. The truth is in this box, in the letters and the journals. The truth about my family, about the money, about the man I was before I met you. The money? What money? We had never had money. We'd lived a simple life, paycheck to paycheck. Richard was a master carpenter, respected and skilled, but we were never wealthy. We had enough. We had love. That was our currency. I read on, my confusion mounting. I didn't want that life to touch you, to taint the beautiful, honest world we built together. I ran from it, and I never looked back. But I couldn't bring myself to destroy the proof, the story of why I chose you, chose us, over everything else. It's all here. Read the letters from my father. Read my journals from that year. You'll understand. Forgive me for not telling you sooner. I just loved you too much to burden you with my past. Whatever happens, know this. Every single day with you was the best day of my life. You were my real inheritance. All my love, always. Richard. I read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through my tears. a box of ghosts, a secret past, money. None of it made sense. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. I had been married to this man for 35 years. I thought I knew everything about him. But this letter, this trunk, it suggested a history I couldn't even imagine. I looked into the trunk. The bundles of letters were tied with twine. One bundle was labeled Father, 1978. Another, Journals, 1978 to 1979. I reached in and picked up the first bundle. The letters were on heavy, expensive stationery, the letterhead embossed with the name Vance Industrial. The handwriting was sharp, angry, slanted. I opened the first one. The words leaped off the page, filled with a cold, aristocratic rage. It was from Richard's father, a man I had never met, a man Richard had told me died when he was young. But these letters were from 1978, the year before we met. He hadn't been dead, he had been disowning his son. "You are a fool, Richard," the letter began. "To throw away your birthright, your legacy, for some childish, moralistic fantasy is an act of profound weakness. This company has been in our family for 3 generations. It has made us powerful. It has made us respected. Your refusal to take your rightful place at its head is not just an insult to me, it is a betrayal of your blood." I read on, my stomach twisting into a knot. Letter after letter detailed the fight. Vance Industrial, it seemed, was a company that had made its fortune in ways that were legally questionable and morally bankrupt. There were mentions of deals with corrupt regimes, of union busting, of environmental damage deliberately covered up. Richard's father saw it all as the cost of doing business, of maintaining their wealth and status. Richard, who had just finished college, saw it as a legacy of poison. He had refused to take part. He had walked away from it all. From millions, from a dynasty. The final letter was brutal. "You are no longer my son. I have written you out of my will and out of my life. Do not contact me again. You have made your pathetic blue-collar bed. Now lie in it." I dropped the letters as if they were burning my hands. My mind was reeling. The Richard I knew, the quiet, humble carpenter who took pride in a perfectly joined corner, who taught our son how to throw a baseball, who read poetry to me by the fire. This man had walked away from a fortune on principle. He had chosen a life of simplicity and hard work, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He had chosen it for us, and he had never, ever told me. He had never made me feel like our life was second best. He had never hinted at what he had sacrificed. He had protected me from the knowledge, from the weight of it. Now I understood his quiet sadness sometimes, the distant look in his eyes when we'd see stories of the ultra-rich on the news. I had always assumed it was just a quiet disapproval of their excess. Now I knew it was the look of a man gazing across a vast chasm at a life he had deliberately abandoned. All the pieces fell into place. His estrangement from his family, which he'd always been vague about. His fierce insistence on living within our means, on never taking on debt. His deep, abiding belief in the dignity of honest labor. It wasn't just a philosophy, it was a rebellion. And in that moment, my grief for him was eclipsed by an overwhelming wave of love and awe. He was a better man than I had ever known. A king who had abdicated his throne to live in a cottage with me. The sheer integrity of it took my breath away. And then, a new feeling rose up, hot and sharp. Rage. Rage at my children. They, the grandchildren of a man who had built a corrupt empire, had no idea. They were so obsessed with the small, petty inheritance of this house, so eager to liquidate their father's simple life for a quick payout, while he had walked away from unimaginable wealth without a second thought. The irony was so bitter it tasted like acid. They were chasing the very thing he had run from. They were the embodiment of the legacy he had rejected. I sat there on the kitchen floor, surrounded by the ghosts of my husband's past, for what felt like hours. The sun set, and the room grew dark, but I didn't turn on a light. I just sat there, in the silence, trying to absorb the enormity of what I had discovered. This trunk, this flooded cellar, it wasn't a burden. It was a gift. It was the final chapter of my husband's story, the one he had been too humble to tell me himself. He had left it for me to find, trusting that I would understand. My phone buzzed on the counter, startling me. It was Mark. I ignored it. It buzzed again. A text message appeared on the screen. "Mom, talk to the realtor. She said you haven't moved much out. The 60 days will go fast. Do you need us to hire movers to help you?" It was so condescending, so dismissive. He wasn't asking if I was okay. He was managing his asset. I felt a sudden, powerful urge to call him, to scream at him, to tell him what a fool he was, what a pale, pathetic imitation of his father's values he had become. But I didn't. What would be the point? He wouldn't get it. He would probably just see the story of Vance Industrial as a missed opportunity, a jackpot his father had foolishly thrown away. They would never understand the choice he made. It's a strange thing, discovering you've been living one story when the truth was another, far grander story, all along. If you've made it this far, maybe you know what that's like. Maybe you've uncovered a secret about your family or your past that changed everything. It can be a profoundly lonely experience, feeling like you're the only one who knows the truth. If this is hitting you, I want you to know you're not alone. This community is built on people who understand that our real lives are often much more complicated than they appear on the surface. Take a moment and just let me know in the comments if you've ever felt that way. We're here to listen. Now back to the kitchen floor. As I sat there, a new resolve began to harden inside me. I was not going to let Richard's story be sold for scrap. I was not going to let his legacy be packed up and hauled away by strangers. This house might belong to my children now, but the truth in this trunk? That belonged to me. It was my inheritance, and I was going to honor it. I spent the rest of the night reading. I read Richard's journals from the year he left his family. They were filled with the anguish and conviction of a young man making an impossible choice. He wrote about the arguments with his father, about the pain of being cut off, but also about the exhilarating freedom of being his own man. And then, he wrote about meeting me. "I met a woman today," one entry read. "Her name is Eleanor. She works at the library. She has a laugh that makes you feel like the sun has just come out. When I'm with her, I don't think about the money or the fighting. I just think about building something real, something clean, with my own two hands." Reading those words felt like he was in the room with me, whispering in my ear. He hadn't just chosen a different life, he had chosen me. I was the cornerstone of his new world. The next morning, I woke up on the sofa, stiff and sore, with Richard's journal resting on my chest. For the first time in 2 years, I felt a sense of purpose. I knew what I had to do. I went back to the trunk. I had only gone through the first layer of letters and journals. I started digging deeper. Beneath the bundles of paper, there were several large, sealed manila envelopes, stiff with documents. I opened the first one. It contained old stock certificates for Vance Industrial, signed over to Richard and dated 1977. At the bottom of each was a note in his handwriting: refused. He hadn't just said no. He had formally rejected the transfer of ownership. The second envelope was thicker. I opened it, and a cascade of legal documents fell out. It was a file his father's lawyers had sent him. It contained evidence of the company's wrongdoing, internal memos, damning financial reports, whistleblower complaints that had been bought off and buried. His father hadn't sent them as a warning. He had sent them as a lesson in power, in how the world really worked. "This is what it takes to protect what is ours," a note from his father read. For Richard, it had been the final straw. But he had kept the proof. He had kept the evidence of the poison he'd walked away from. Then I found the last envelope. tucked away at the very bottom of the trunk. It was different from the others. It was newer, and it had a single label on it: "For our new beginning." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside wasn't a story of the past, but a plan for the future. It was a deed to a 5-acre plot of land in upstate New York in the Catskill Mountains. It was dated 1980, the year after we were married. He had bought it with the last of his own money, the money he'd saved before his family cut him off. It was his first, and only, major purchase as a free man. Tucked in with the deed were hand-drawn sketches. They were architectural drawings for a small cabin. A simple, beautiful, one-room cabin with a large porch and a stone fireplace. There were notes in the margins. View of the sunrise from this window. A workbench for me, a reading nook for Elle. I collapsed onto the floor, the papers spread around me. He had been planning this. He had been dreaming of this. A place for us, away from everything, built with his own hands, on land that was clean. We had talked about it over the years, in a vague, someday kind of way. Someday, when we retire, we'll get a little place in the country, we'd say. I thought it was just a dream, but it was real. He had bought the land. He had designed the house. He was just waiting for the right time. The time that never came. A sob escaped my lips, a sound of such profound loss and profound love that it felt like it was tearing me in two. He had given me a future, and I hadn't even known it existed. My children were taking my past, but my husband had left me a future. The choice was so clear it was like a bell ringing in the silent house. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to be the sad, displaced old woman they thought I was. I was going to be the woman Richard had believed me to be. I was going to build his cabin. The phone rang again. This time, it was Jessica, I answered. "Mom? Mark said you didn't answer. Is everything okay?" Her voice had that familiar edge of strained patience. "I'm fine, Jessica," I said, and I was surprised by the strength in my own voice. It was a voice she hadn't heard before. "Okay, well, the realtor is getting antsy. She says the house looks, well, it looks like you haven't started packing." "I've been busy with the cellar," I said calmly. There was a pause. "The cellar?" "Mom, just leave it. We told you. We can hire people for that. It's disgusting." "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it was made of steel. "I'm handling it. It's my responsibility." "But why? It's just junk." "It's not junk," I said, looking at the papers spread around me. "It's my inheritance." She didn't understand, of course. There was a confused silence on the other end of the line. "Whatever, Mom," she finally said, her voice tight with irritation. "Just make sure it's done. We're closing in 6 weeks." She hung up. I didn't care. The conversation was meaningless. I was no longer living in their world of closing dates and market values. I was living in Richard's world now, a world of integrity, love, and a 5-acre plot of land waiting for me in the mountains. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. I felt more alive than I had in years. I hired a local hauling company, a man and his 2 sons who were kind and respectful, to clear out the rest of the house. I let them take everything: the furniture, the dishes, the rugs. I watched them empty the rooms where I had lived my life, and I felt not sadness, but a strange, liberating lightness. I was shedding a skin. The only things I kept were my small pile of personal treasures and the green footlocker, which I guarded like a dragon guarding its hoard. I made phone calls. I found the county clerk's office in the small town listed on the deed. A helpful woman with a warm, friendly voice looked up the property. "Oh yes, that parcel on Whisper Creek Road," she said. "Been in the Vance name for over 30 years. Taxes are all paid up to date." "Paid up?" I was confused. "How is that possible?" I asked. "My husband passed away 2 years ago." "Well, ma'am," she said, "it looks like the taxes were paid in a lump sum, in advance, about 3 years ago." They're paid in full for the next 20 years. I had to sit down. Richard. He had not only bought the land, he had made sure it would be safe, that it would never be a burden. He had provided for me in a way that went so far beyond money. He had given me time. He had given me security. He had given me a new beginning, free and clear. The final phone call I made was to my children. I called them both at the same time, a conference call. I kept it brief. The house is empty, I told them. You can have the keys whenever you like. There was a moment of surprised silence. Wow, Mom, that was fast, Mark said, a note of approval in his voice. See, I knew you could do it. Where are you going to go? Jessica asked, the question sounding more like an accusation, as if my future plans were an inconvenience to her. I have a place, I said. Don't worry about me, I have everything I need. I didn't tell them about the land, or the cabin, or their grandfather's secret history. It wasn't theirs. It was mine and Richard's. It was a story they hadn't earned the right to hear. I wished them well, in a detached, polite way, and then I said goodbye. I knew, in that moment, that it was likely the last real conversation I would ever have with them. The bonds had been broken not by me, but by them, and there was no going back. The day I left, I did one last walkthrough of the empty house. The rooms echoed with my footsteps. Sunlight streamed through the bare windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. There were no ghosts here anymore. It was just a building, a shell. My home was no longer here. My home was packed in a green footlocker in the back of my old station wagon. I left the keys on the kitchen counter, and I didn't look back. The drive north was beautiful. I watched the suburbs and cities melt away into rolling farmland, and then into the dense, green forests of the Catskills. I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a feeling I hadn't had in a very long time. I found the town, a small, charming place with a single main street. I found the county clerk's office and met the woman with the kind voice, who gave me a map and pointed me in the right direction. Whisper Creek Road was a dirt road, winding and beautiful, shaded by a canopy of ancient trees. And then I saw it. A small, overgrown clearing with a simple wooden signpost, nearly swallowed by ivy. On it, carved into the wood, was one word: Eleanor. I parked the car and got out. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. I walked onto the land. My land. Our land. It was more beautiful than I could have imagined. A gentle slope led down to a rushing creek, its water clear and sparkling over smooth stones. Through the trees, I could see the blue haze of the mountains in the distance. I walked to the spot where Richard had sketched the cabin, a small rise overlooking the creek. The view of the sunrise would be perfect from here. I could see it all so clearly. The stone fireplace, the reading nook, the porch where I would drink my morning coffee. It wasn't a dream. It was a blueprint. The first few months were hard. I lived in a small, rented room in town. I found a local architect, a young woman who looked at Richard's sketches with a reverence that made me want to weep. He had a wonderful eye, she said. This is a beautiful design. Simple, strong. We can build this. I found a contractor, an older man with kind eyes and hands as calloused as Richard's had been. He didn't treat me like a foolish widow. He treated me like a partner. We walked the land together, and he showed me how we could use the stone from the creek for the fireplace, how we could orient the house to get the best light. There were moments of doubt, of course. Moments of profound loneliness in my small rented room, when the weight of what I was trying to do seemed too much to bear. But then I would take out the green trunk. I would read Richard's letters again, or look at his sketches for the cabin. And I would remember why I was doing this. I was not just building a house. I was building a monument to a choice. A monument to a man who had understood that true wealth has nothing to do with money. Slowly, painstakingly, the cabin began to take shape. I was there every day, watching, learning. I learned the difference between a king stud and a jack stud. I learned how to mix mortar. The contractor, whose name was Sam, would often find small jobs for me to do, sanding a piece of trim or staining a board. He understood that I needed to have my own hands on this project. It was my way of continuing my conversation with Richard. One day, Sam found me sitting on the half-finished porch, just looking out at the trees. "He'd be proud of you, you know," he said quietly. "It takes a lot of guts to start over." I just nodded, my throat too thick with emotion to speak. He was right. And for the first time, I was proud of myself. The house was finished in the fall, just as the leaves were turning to brilliant shades of red and gold. It was small, perfect, and it smelled of fresh-cut pine. The stone fireplace drew beautifully. The reading nook was flooded with afternoon light. On the day I moved in, the only furniture I had was a mattress on the floor, a single chair, and the green footlocker which I placed at the foot of the bed like a treasure chest. That first night, I built a fire and sat in my chair, just listening to the sound of the creak and the crackle of the flames. The house was filled with a profound and welcoming silence. It was the sound of peace, the sound of being home. I have lived in my cabin for a year now. I have a small garden where I grow vegetables. I have friendships in the town. I spend my days reading, hiking along the creek, and working on the small woodworking projects Richard never had the time for. I am not lonely. I feel Richard's presence here, in the sturdy beams of the house, in the warmth of the fire, in the beauty of the sunrise over the mountains. He gave me this. He gave me a second chance at a life I didn't even know I was missing. Sometimes I think about my children. I wonder if they are happy with their smart investments and their big houses. I hope they are. But I know that what they have is built on a foundation of sand. They sold their history for cash. They traded their father's legacy for a number in a bank account. What I have is built on rock. It is built on the truth that was hidden in a flooded cellar. My inheritance wasn't a house, it was a story. A story of a quiet hero who taught me that the most valuable things in this life are not the things we own, but the choices we make and the love we protect. Home isn't just four walls and a roof. It's the truth you build your life on. It's the place where your story makes sense. For me, that place was waiting for me at the bottom of a dark, flooded cellar. Sometimes, you have to go through the darkness to find the light. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in second chances and the power of starting over, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel. It's a community for people who understand that the most important inheritances have nothing to do with money. And I want you to tell me in the comments, what is the most valuable thing you've ever inherited? I'll be reading every one. Because every one of our stories matters.
Yeah, this is where I'll call it since I have to go to bed. But we're streaming tomorrow night, Stardew, as usual. Everyone check the Discord because the marriage candidate polls have started. So we're on round 2 at the moment. But yeah. Thanks for hanging out, everybody. For anyone who doesn't know, check out my schedule in the link in my bio for TikTok. Or it's just up on the Purple app. But yeah, sorry you came so late. You don't have to be sorry, Mochi. It's good to see you. Hope you have a great night. But yeah, I'll see everyone later. And everyone have a great night.